politely suggest that maybe some of those works is back.
Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Simon Parkin, and I'll introduce Simon in just a moment. A little housekeeping first, please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we will do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility, which will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded. You will find it on our website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. There you will find recordings of other past events and details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Simon Parkin is an award-winning British author and journalist who regularly writes for The Guardian and The Observer newspapers and is a contributing writer for The New Yorker. His previous non-fiction work, A Game of Birds and Wolves, was shortlisted for the Mountbatten Prize and optioned for film by Steven Spielberg. Simon was a finalist in the Foreign Press Association Media Awards and has received 2 awards from the Society of Professional Journalists. His latest book is The Island of Extraordinary Captives, a true story of an artist, a spy, and a wartime scandal, and that is what he will be speaking about this evening. He joins us from West Sussex. Simon, we're very keen to hear your presentation, so without any more hesitation, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Welcome. It's lovely to meet you all, albeit digitally. So I'm going to just share some slides for my talk. Hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so one spring a few years ago, I was leafing through a beige folder in the National Archives in South London in search of a story. I'd heard about a prisoner of war camp in the Lake District, a converted stately home called Grisdale Hall. So many captured German sailors were sent to Grisdale Hall that it became known to locals as the U-boat Hotel. And the image of a grand English house overrun with German POWs captured my attention. I imagined it to be a bit like Downton Abbey, but with Nazis, a pretty compelling juxtaposition, I think you'll agree. So I come to the National Archives to research British POW camps in Britain at the time. The folder I'd requested was filled with correspondence concerning the administrative difficulties in moving POWs between camps, sort of essential but pretty boring war stuff. And I turned a page and straightened. Tucked in the middle of the sheaf was the front cover of what looked like a homemade newspaper. There were hand-drawn illustrations, excitable write-ups of concerts and theatrical performances, and a long, vivid description of the experience of visiting the camp post office. The text was all in English, and while it appeared to have been produced by wartime prisoners, it included an exhortation from the editor to tell everyone that you hate the Nazis. I thought, what? Like many people, I was only vaguely aware of the fact that Britain had interned German and Austrian and Italian people during the Second World War. Unlike the wartime internment of Japanese Americans in the United States, which is an episode of ongoing lament, the British internment of so-called enemy aliens has been mostly kept separate from the prevailing story Britain tells itself about its wartime character. The camp newspaper appeared to offer a window into an unfamiliar, alternate universe, history of the war, where the supposed villains were the victims and the supposed heroes the perpetrators. The document set me on a new path, not only to learn everything about this world, but also to discover a story or a person who might compel me through it. Hilda Marchant, star reporter from the Daily Express, first heard the story from a sailor. 2 nights earlier, he explained to her, he had been standing on the deck of a ship and watched as a confetti of parachutes drifted into Rotterdam harbour. Dangling from each silhouetted disc, the sailor insisted, were German soldiers dressed not in Nazi uniforms, but in skirts and blouses, and each one of them carried a submachine gun. When the paratroopers landed, men and women working as cleaners and servants emerged from the basements and back doors of their houses wearing German uniforms. These individuals, the witness said, had come to Holland claiming to be refugees from Nazi oppression, but they were in fact sleeper agents posing as asylum seekers. On the 13th of May 1940, 2 days after the invasion of the Netherlands began, the Daily Express published Marchant's story under the headline, "Germans dropped women parachutists as decoys." And peppered throughout Marchant's story was the term fifth columnist. Marchant was one of the first people in Britain to adopt the phrase, which was coined during the 1936 Spanish Civil War, as shorthand for traitors posed to support an enemy invasion from within. British newspapers had begun to refer to fifth columnists after the German invasion of Norway a few months earlier, when reports circulated that spies had been installed in the country to aid the German invasion. By the time Marchant's story ran, there wasn't a reader in Britain unaware of the term, its meaning, or the notion that a similar network of duplicitous immigrants might lurk in their own towns and cities. Hilda's story's claims of treachery were, it would later transpire, greatly exaggerated. But the image of a double-crossing immigrant proved indelible, and not only among the readers of newspapers. The British envoy to the Dutch government, Sir Neville Bland, had also been in Rotterdam during the invasion. When he reached London 2 days later, he drafted his eyewitness report for the government. This account, titled Fifth Column Menace, was vivid and fearful. No matter how superficially charming and devoted they appear, Bland wrote, every German or Austrian in Britain is a real and grave menace. When the signal is given to invade Britain, Bland continued, there will be satellites of the monster all over the country who will at once embark on widespread sabotage and attacks on civilians. Britain, Bland continued, cannot afford to take this risk. All Germans and Austrians at least ought to be interned at once. Bland's report was widely distributed in Whitehall. A copy reached King George VI, who summoned the Home Secretary, Sir John Anderson, for a meeting at Buckingham Palace. You must take immediate action against political fifth columnists and other enemies of the state, the King told Anderson, both men and women. When the report's claims were then broadcast by the BBC that week, they had an immediate effect on the British public's attitude towards refugees, which until now had been broadly characterised by fragile tolerance. Act, do it now, bled a Daily Mail article by G. Ward Price on the 24th of May. All refugees should be drafted without delay to a remote part of the country and kept under strict supervision. You fail to realise, Price wrote, that every German is an agent. A widespread ignorance of the true numbers of foreigners to whom Britain had offered asylum hastened this change in public attitudes. One poll asked British citizens to estimate the number of refugees who had come to Britain from Nazi Germany during the previous 6 years. Respondents put the number at anywhere between 2 and 4 million. The true figure was just 73,500. Hysteria had overcome logic. Most refugees spoke thickly accented English, were unaccustomed to British social norms, and would make ineffectual spies. Fifth columnists were far likelier to come from the ranks of British fascists. As the politician Herbert Delaney Hughes wrote at the time, it is lamentable how quickly people seem to have forgotten who exactly the refugees are and how it is they came to this country. Most British citizens acknowledged that there was injustice inherent in mass internment, but they felt that it was nevertheless an appropriate, justifiable measure. "You can't say which is good and which is bad," said one respondent to a May poll, by which time half of those interviewed favoured the internment of all enemy aliens. "Some of them is very nice people, but it's safest to pull them all in." The British police came for Peter Fleischmann in the early hours. It reminded the teenager of the Gestapo's moonlit roundups that he had narrowly avoided at home in Berlin 2 years earlier. At that time, a kindly policeman had knocked on the gates of the Auerbach orphanage where Peter lived, and on the day before Kristallnacht, warned that the Nazis were coming for him. Years earlier, Peter's parents had drowned in an accident while driving by the Wannsee Lake. The couple had been writers for an anti-fascist newspaper, and Peter learned that the steering had been tampered with. Their deaths were apparently an act of political sabotage. Now it seemed the Gestapo wanted to wipe out the Fleischmann's only child. Peter had already quit his studies at the Royal School of Art in Berlin. So, with no remaining ties, he fled to the south of the city and hid in the basement of his family's former housekeeper, while the brown shirts tore through Berlin and raided his orphanage. When, 3 weeks later, the first Kindertransport was arranged to bring children out of Germany, Peter, who was just a few weeks shy of his 17th birthday, just qualified for rescue. On the 1st of December 1938, alongside a brood of the city's Jewish orphans, he embarked the train, watched by orphanage staff and a few Gestapo officers who had come to watch the children make their pioneering journey. At 5:30 in the morning on December the 2nd, 1938, 2 hours before sunrise, the TSS Prague cleaved the mist over the water and docked at Parkeston Quay, Harwich, on the Essex coastline. Because Peter was part of this first delegation to arrive in Britain on the Kindertransport, there were journalists and cameras there to greet them. And this is some of the raw footage from Pathé News. And we can actually see Peter here boarding the bus that's going to take him to the holiday camp. You can see him there in the tan raincoat, holding his art folder under his arm, a bit like an A-level student, perhaps. And there he is to the left of the picture. And the children were driven short distance to the holiday camp, the chalets here, there, disembarking. And one of the first things they do when they arrive is to start playing some games. Here they are playing table tennis. You can see with their identification tags still around their necks. And here's Peter on the left of the frame, just watching them play. In Britain, Peter, who dreamed of becoming a professional artist, was taken in by the owners of a Manchester business that specialised in colouring old photographs of young soldiers who had died in the Great War. This couple provided him with employment and a room in their home. The hours were long and the conditions, a basement filled with rats and shadows, were insalubrious. But the work was artist adjacent and might, Peter reasoned, provide the experience he needed to attend art school in England. In Whitehall, however, the debate surrounding the reports from Holland soon derailed Peter's meagre plans. Churchill, during his first cabinet meeting as Prime Minister, agreed to the internment of all male enemy aliens between the age of 16 and 60, currently living within the seacoast counties of Britain. This was the protected area on the coastline where, in the event of a Nazi invasion, a spy could theoretically cause the most harm. Men were to be interned regardless of the category that tribunals had bestowed on them several months earlier. The following day, on Sunday, the 12th of May, Scotland Yard's fleet of motor cars roared out of police headquarters. Many of the officers dispatched to make that day's arrests had been unaware of their task until they arrived at work that morning. And by the end of this first mass roundup, around 2,000 refugees had been taken into custody and handed to the military authorities to be interned. The Home Secretary, John Anderson, was opposed to mass internment, a position that he hoped to hold, he wrote, unless the war begins to go badly. Earlier in 1940, he wrote to his father of the danger posed to justice by national paranoia. In wartime, people are easily worked up. A spy scare can be started at any time as a stunt, he wrote. Now, with German troops in France, the threat of enemy invasion looming, and newspapers stewing with reports of fifth columnists, Anderson was forced to concede that there were, as he put it, various bodies and groups of persons in this country against whom action will need to be taken, including the refugees. So throughout May, the protected area began to expand from coastal counties inland, from Devon to Dorset, from Mersey to Cheshire, until no one in Britain was safe from the threat of immediate arrest and indefinite internment based upon nothing more than their nationality, ethnicity, religion, or political beliefs. Internment was in the best interest of the internee, Churchill argued, since the public temper means such persons would be in great danger if left at liberty. This argument precisely echoed that made by the Nazi officials to justify the arrest of the party's political opponents a few years earlier. In a speech delivered in March 1933, for example, shortly after the opening of Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp, Heinrich Himmler reasoned, "I felt compelled to make these arrests because in many parts of the city there is so much agitation it has been impossible for me to guarantee the safety of those individuals who have provoked it." For men and women who had survived and fled the Nazi concentration camps at Dachau and Buchenwald, now interned by their supposed liberators, here was a befuddling injustice. And when Hitler learned of Churchill's internment policy, he reportedly gloated, "The enemies of Germany are now the enemies of Britain too. Where are those much vaunted democratic liberties of which the English boast?" Status and class, those twin armaments of privilege, provided little protection. Nazism had pushed a wave of luminaries towards Britain, and now these Oxbridge dons, surgeons, dentists, lawyers, and celebrated artists were taken into custody. For example, the police arrested Emil Goldman, a 67-year-old professor from the University of Vienna, in the grounds of Eton College. At Cambridge University, dozens of staff and students were detained in the Guildhall, including Prince Frederick of Prussia, a grandson of Queen Victoria, who, while interned, received food packages from Fortnum and Mason, allegedly paid for by the royal family. That year's Cambridge law finals nearly had to be cancelled because one of the intern professors had locked away the papers and taken with him the key. In the early hours of the 5th of July, a Black Maria pulled up at the presage home of Albert and Gertrude Ripkin, who had taken in Fleischmann and given him work. Peter awoke to the sound of knocking. The officer's instruction was curt and urgent. "Get your clothes, come with us." Neither a soldier nor a criminal, Peter, who was one of 90 aliens and refugees arrested by Salford police that morning, was denied the civil rights that even convicts enjoy. No charge, no trial, no bail. None of his story mattered, not the fact he had been orphaned and made homeless by the Nazi regime, not the fact he had been brought to England as a destitute child by the British government, nor that he had been carefully interviewed by Lord Chief Justice Reynard Goddard, one of the most senior judges in the land and judged to pose no security risk to his adoptive country. In this new reality, subject to the British government's panicked measures, only Peter's nationality mattered. Buffeted along a twisted road by the winds of history, he was again unwelcome and homeless. Peter, like many of those arrested in northwest England, first arrived at a transit camp known as Wharf Mills, a massive, decaying, derelict cotton mill that cast a brutish silhouette on the Lancashire horizon. The building, which was 3 stories tall at one section, had sat empty and dampening until the British Army moved in early June 1940. The first internees arrived just 7 days later. These men had ample time to take in their new home's thuggish frontage. From Bury Station, the internees were marched for 4 miles along the Manchester Road towards their new home. It was a walk of shame. Hostile onlookers watched the men as they were paraded in front of the public as prisoners. To be marched like a bloody prisoner of war with people watching, recalled Peter Katz, a pastor in his mid-50s, who was one of the first arrivals. That really hurt. I felt degraded. By the time Peter arrived, Wharf Mills was packed. Inside, British soldiers under the command of a retired officer, Major Alfred Braybrook, sat behind a row of tables, ready to check each man's belongings. The internees lined up behind ropes, and each man smelled the stench of disinfectant while he waited to be called forward. On Peter's turn, a private grabbed his bag and tipped the contents onto the table, while a seated officer thumbed through his wallet. Peter assumed the officers were searching for any items that might be used as weapons, but it soon became clear that anything of value was in danger of confiscation. Just as the Nazis had robbed so many of these men of their valuables, so the British officers now took chocolates, cigarettes, writing paper and typewriters and watches, distributing these items among themselves in full view of the looted. The breach of privacy revealed not only what each internee had considered sufficiently important to bring with him during the harried moments of his arrest, but also the range of professions represented among the captives. Doctors watched bewildered as the soldiers pocketed their stethoscopes. Academics argued that they should be allowed to keep their textbooks, while artists pleaded to hang on to their drawing paper. For many of the men, this ransacking crowned a brief period that had transformed their view of Britain and their place within it. We went around breathing injustice and feeling very sore about all kinds of things, wrote Hirsch Uri, who was arrested alongside a number of other young Orthodox Jews, most of whom had also come to England on a Kindertransport. I remember very clearly, noted Klaus Moser, who later became chairman of the Royal Opera House, and this was the dominating thought, the feeling of insult. The whole operation was panicked and cruel. In Wharf Mills, 2,000 internees shared a single bathtub and 18 water taps. Laundry could be washed in an empty room, but without soap or drying facilities. Clothes and blankets often emerged as dirty as before. There was no sewerage system in place, and the lavatories amounted to 60 buckets outside, beneath an oblong tent. Conditions in the camp were considered by the numerous German doctors among the inmates to be a liability for the spread of disease. They wrote and co-signed a memorandum of complaint to Major Braybrook. Dr. Simon Isaac, a former professor at the University of Frankfurt, who had overseen makeshift hospitals on the Russian front in the First World War, wrote that he had never seen a place less fit for the accommodation of human beings. To be imprisoned in a building not even fit for beasts, another internee wrote, had a profound effect on the men's view of the country that had offered them sanctuary. Many have ceased to believe in the British spirit of humanity, which before they had acclaimed. The indignities of isolation from friends and relatives, the meagre food rations, the lice, and inadequate sanitary arrangements led many internees to draw parallels between the mill and the Nazi concentration camps from which they had fled. According to one official Ministry of Information report, 2 men, both of whom had previously been incarcerated in Nazi concentration camps, died by suicide. After a week spent at Wharf Mills, Peter was transported to one of the more permanent camps, 10 of which were situated on the Isle of Man, where women and children were also interned. When he reached the island, Fleischmann's home was P Camp, or Hutchinson, where around 1,200 internees were billeted in a requisitioned boarding house that bordered a picturesque square with views that led down to Douglas Harbour. After the indignities of Wharf Mills, Hutchinson had a bucolic quality, which at times felt something akin to a holiday camp. Hutchinson Camp opened on the 13th of July, 1940. 2 days later, some men emerged from their boarding houses carrying chairs and ladders, which they proceeded to set up around the terraced lawn. These men beckoned passers-by, and when they had a small crowd, began to hold forth on their specialist subject. Soon the lawn became filled with speakers and their various audiences, like, as one observer put it, a scene from ancient Athens. A listener could wander freely between subjects, from Greek philosophy, the industrial uses of synthetic fibers, to Shakespeare's sonnets. Before he transferred to Hutchinson, Bruno Ahrens, an architect who had designed Berlin's highly influential modernist housing estates, had organized lessons for schoolboys in his previous transit camp. Now, recognizing the illustrious group of teachers in the camp's midst, Ahrens approached the camp commandant, the former advertising executive named Captain Hubert Daniel, and requested permission to organize a formal schedule of lectures. Daniel, who was known as Danny to his friends, offered Ahrens a room on the first floor of the camp's administration building. Together with an assistant, Dr. Klaus Hinrichsen, a young art historian, the pair began to assign daily lectures, organize theatre and music performances, and, most urgently, arrange lessons and tutorials for the schoolboy-aged internees to prepare them for the exams that they would hopefully be able to sit as soon as they were released. Ahrens christened the outfit, which was founded just 4 days after Hutchinson's opening, the Cultural Department. But Daniel, having learned that his charges included a considerable number of eminent academics, insisted that it be known as Hutchinson Camp University. The department's remit was wide-ranging, programming lessons and arranging the borrowing of books from local and mainland libraries, the securing of art supplies and musical instruments, and the organising of teaching at all grades of knowledge. There were those who would endlessly play cards or poker or smoke cigars, not moving until the next batch of food parcels arrived. But those who chose to participate in the cultural schedule were richly rewarded. Helmut Weissenborn considered it a miracle of human willpower, how quickly the camp transformed into a kind of university, one that was, in the lawyer Fred Ullman's estimation, the best I had ever attended. Efforts weren't limited to academic pursuits. Captain Daniel proved himself to be a benevolent overseer, and at the urging of his frustrated artist wife, Daniel, who was himself a keen photographer, provided materials and studio space for the artists in the camp, and he even hired in a grand piano for an outdoor matinee performance by the interned musician Marjan Ravitz. While many of the celebrated artists in the camp began to produce and exhibit works of art, the journalists published a fortnightly camp newspaper that featured news, articles, fiction, and illustrations, all edited by Leo Freund, who used the pen name Michael Corvin. In London, campaigners such as the MP Eleanor Rathbone, Helen Rota, secretary of the Artist Refugee Committee, and the self-effacing Quaker Bertha Bracey, secured for the internees books to open an impromptu library where Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca proved to be the most borrowed titles. They also secured for the internees a table tennis table and, in time, items for a shop where the internees could buy supplies and even alcohol. There were dozens of clubs for special interests, including ones for Spanish, French, and Norwegian speakers, and a Collegio Dante for fans of the Italian poet, and an English section run by the journalist Ludwig Elster for those who wish to become better acquainted with English life and institutions. Professional actors and film directors who were interned in the camp began to stage productions of, among others, A Midsummer Night's Dream and Of Mice and Men. Some of the technical-minded members of the group fashioned stage lights out of old jam jars, which had a silvery reflective surface on the inside. The brightness of the stage lights could be controlled by screwing and unscrewing bulbs into a circuit, enabling the lighting team to create the effect of a sunrise or a sunset. To circumvent the difficulty of staging period plays without period clothing, the Hutchinson actors reinterpreted several plays in contemporary settings, using modern clothing and props, roll-neck sweaters instead of livery, machine guns instead of swords, and in an early example of dressing actors in contemporary fashion for period plays. Representatives of the technical school installed a speaker system throughout the camp. This was co-designed by Dr. Hans Rothfels of St. John's College, Oxford, and consisted of 2,700 yards of wire, which fed 53 speakers in each of the house's dining rooms. This enabled the broadcast of radio programs from the BBC, and soon internees were able to use the radio to broadcast talks, English lessons, and even entertainment written and performed in the camp. Occasionally, vinyl records were played in lieu of an evening concert, and the system also allowed the commandant to relay messages from his desk to the entire camp. Sometimes tipsy from afternoon drinks, Captain Daniel would announce the latest cricket scores to the bewildered European internees in garbled officers' English that many of his prisoners struggled to understand. The artists in the camp soon established a semi-exclusive artist cafe housed in a laundry room extension of House 19. With its whitewashed walls and bubbling paint, water taps and washboards, the venue lacked the sophistication of the continental cafes the men were used to, but the room was sizable and relatively comfortable, and it provided a relatively comfortable space for afternoon meetings, conversation, and poetry recitals. For Peter Fleischmann, who had no ties to the outside world, Hutchinson provided the artistic education that had been cut short by the Nazis. Shortly after his arrival in the camp, he spotted a strange-looking artist sitting in one corner of the square. He watched as this man stopped people when they walked past and offered to sketch their portrait in as little as 5 minutes for a small fee. As commercially efficient as a Leicester Square caricaturist, the man priced his portraits on a sliding scale: £3 for a head and shoulders, £4 for head, shoulders and arms, and £5 for a half figure. When someone informed Peter that the man in the loaded coat was the famed Dadaist Kurt Schwitters, he was somewhat surprised at the straightforwardness of the portraits, but immediately signed up for life drawing lessons, hosted by Schwitters and popular among those who wanted to learn to paint or who merely wanted a closer look at the celebrity. Under Schwitter's guidance, Peter painted still life canvases depicting items in his immediate vicinity: his knife, his shoes, his fork and plate, and flowers. He continued his work outside the lessons, painting on the hardcover panels torn from books that he borrowed from the camp library. The sculptors Paul Hamann and George Ehrlich showed him how to smuggle clay dug from the local hills back into the camp and how to remove the gritstone sand and to cast. The wood carver Ernst Müller-Blensdorf showed Fleischmann how to sculpt blocks of firewood. I had always wanted to paint, and here was the opportunity, Peter later recalled. I had a chance at last to learn from morning to night every day. In November 1940, the artist staged a major exhibition, timed to coincide with the opening of a new hall building built next to the camp laundry and above the canteen, a generously sized venue designed to house musical and theatrical performances and indoor sporting events. It was Klaus Hinrichsen's privilege and burden to choose which works by which artists could be shown, while ensuring that the space did not become overcrowded and without bruising the delicate egos of the competing artists who were, when it came to exhibitions, used to having things their own way. It was, in short, a nightmare, as Hinrichsen put it. No artist is ever satisfied with the number of his works accepted, nor with the space where they're shown. But for Peter, the event presented an opportunity to produce and exhibit work alongside many of Europe's finest artists, an unimaginable prospect outside the camp's warped reality. 4 of his works were chosen for display. And on Tuesday, the 19th of November, 1940, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Captain Daniel entered the exhibition, trailed by his entourage. Peter proudly stood next to his work. It was an enjoyable day for the artists, though on some level it must have thrown the extent to which their professional horizons had shrunk into dizzying perspective. Men who had exhibited their work in Berlin's finest galleries were now reduced to jostling for wall space in a remote island boarding house. Peter's experience was the exception. Here was the tangible fulfillment that to him captivity represented an expansion of opportunity. Despite the cultural richness of the camp, depression was rife as men waited for news of their loved ones, worried about their businesses and obsessed over freedom. Lest all this sounds too rosy a situation, Klaus Hinrichsen later noted, let me assure you that all these frantic activities were entered into as a means of distraction from the ever-present anger at the injustice, the constant worry about our wives and our children who have been left without a provider, from the lack of communication and, of course, suffering from the cramped conditions and the lack of freedom. In the autumn of 1940, the British government released a white paper that outlined several categories under which internees could apply for release. Those who were too young or too old, too infirm, or who already had permits to work in positions of national importance could apply to be freed. But artists, writers, and musicians were not included until later revisions, and even then they had to prove that they had achieved distinction in their chosen field. As Helen Rota, secretary of the Artist Refugee Committee, put it to the director of the National Gallery, do you think the criteria could be stretched to include those poor souls who have been too busy being hunted to achieve distinction in the arts? In Whitehall, attitudes to the mass internment policy had begun to shift, hastened by the news of the sinking of the SS Arandora Star, when 650 men, including German and Austrian refugees who had been deported to Canadian internment camps, were drowned when a U-boat torpedoed their liner. It was a shipping disaster with one of the gravest losses of life of the Second World War. The economist John Maynard Keynes, an advisor to the government, claimed that he had not met a single soul inside or outside government departments who is not furious at what is going on. Undoing the mess, however, was proving time-consuming and complex. During the early months of internment, the fact that so many brilliant men of self-evidently anti-Nazi beliefs had been interned highlighted the absurdity of the situation. But as the autumn nights grew longer, any sense of perverse delight soon clotted into dismay and bitterness, as one by one the camp emptied of its celebrated individuals. The weeks until Christmas and after seemed to be one endless gloom and depression, Ullman wrote. Every day I waited in fear and hope until 5 p.m. when the names of the released were announced, only to crawl back to my room, too miserable to eat. By March 1941, 12,500 internees had walked free, representing almost half of those who had been interned the previous summer. On the 7th of October 1941, 1 year, 2 months and 25 days after he arrived in Hutchinson, Peter Fleischmann shook the commandant's hand and bade him farewell. The Artist Refugee Committee had finally found him a place at Beckenham Art College, where Peter was reunited with some of his camp mentors, including Helmut Weissenborn, who had taken up a teaching post there. Toward the end of the war, Peter became a translator for the British Army and returned first to Wharf Mills, which was now a POW camp, and, at the end of hostilities, to Berlin. There he visited the Auerbach orphanage, which he had fled a few years earlier, and which had now been turned to rubble during the Allied bombing raid in the winter of 1943. The destruction of the orphanage had in fact begun far earlier, though. On October the 19th, 1942, the 21st East Transport carried almost 60 Auerbach children, aged between 2 and 16, along with 3 of their carers, to Riga in Latvia, and in a nearby forest, SS officers executed each member of the group. The following month, the remaining Auerbach children left Berlin on the 23rd East Transport. This train went to Auschwitz, and none survived. After the war, everything of which Peter had dreamed since he was a young aspiring artist at the Auerbach orphanage would come true. Under his adopted name, Peter Midgley, he was accepted into the Royal College of Art, where he graduated with first-class honours, the top fine arts student in his year, rewarded with the RCA's prestigious Rome Scholarship. He became a professional artist, securing commissions to create works for British government departments, Oxford, Warwick and York universities, and the Royal Navy. Nothing bettered the training he received at Hutchinson, however. Everything thereafter, he later said, was just a recap. While the internees had been relatively comfortable, internment was a near constant misery for most, one that, as the Oxford academic Paul Jacobsthal wrote, caused a trauma. At least 56 internees died in internment on the Isle of Man, many to suicide. And while Peter Midgley's life was transformed by the people he met during internment, the episode also triggered in him feelings of abandonment that haunted his dreams. Once or twice a year, he would experience the same recurring nightmare. He was back in the camp. Everyone around him was released until finally he was the last one there, permanently forsaken. Every government must balance its humanitarian obligations with the need to uphold national security. But to categorize refugees from Nazi oppression as enemy aliens was to invite populist scorn and hatred upon those most in need of compassion, and represented a moral failing on a national scale. Few went as far as Tristan Bush, a former internee who described the policy as a war crime, but it is indisputable that the hasty measures heaped unhappiness and anguish upon thousands of people already enduring the ordeal of fleeing their previous lives. Only one sentence spoken by Sir John Anderson in the House of Commons on the 22nd of August 1940, months before most of Hutchinson's internees were freed, provided something approaching an apology. Regrettable and deplorable things have happened, he said, as if the cruelties of internment had been the result of natural phenomena and not a series of deliberate choices. In May last year, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a formal apology to the 32,000 Italian Canadians declared enemy aliens during the Second World War, 600 of whom were sent to internment camps. There's been no equivalent attempt to repair the damage by the British authorities in failing to distinguish between refugees and enemy aliens, a dehumanizing term that last year the US government pledged never again to use. The battle between a nation's responsibility to help those in need and to maintain national security persists in every age, every generation. but the notion of the refugee who is not who he or she claims to be is an enduring story that can be easily justified, used to justify institutional cruelty or overreach. While the context and detail shifts, the debate remains the same. Each successive generation must answer the question, how far can we go in the rightful defense of our values before we abandon them along the way? Peter was just one individual in a camp that at its most populous numbered more than 1,200 captives, each man with his own history and legacy. And Hutchinson was, of course, just one of dozens of camps around Britain, Canada, and Australia. The combined total of internees stretched into the tens of thousands. Of course, most of these men were not professors at world-famous universities, or musicians summoned often to play for royalty, or artists who had exhibited across European galleries. Hutchinson's population was much like any other random cross-section of society, a mixture of factory workers and artisans, teachers and intellectuals, doctors, mechanics, builders, and chefs. And yet, placed in these unusual circumstances, this ordinary cross-section of society achieved the extraordinary. Together, they turned a prison into a university, a camp into a cultural centre, a boarding house into an art gallery, a jumble of wires into a broadcast station, a lawn into an amphitheatre. Hutchinson became a microcosm of civilization, and the extraordinariness lay not in the accolades of each individual captive, but in how, as a collective, they embodied humanity's better urges, even while besieged by its baser ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. You've stopped sharing your slides. Excellent. If anybody has a question for Simon, please put it in the Q&A now, and we will endeavour to ask Simon to respond. We have a couple through already. Firstly, from Linda Rosen, who asks, was any schooling arranged for children, or did they actually attend local schools?
Well, certainly within Hutchinson camp, yes, there was a schedule of lessons, and these were taught by many of the academics in the camp. Of course, the youngest that anyone would have been in Hutchinson was 16 years old. The younger children were in one of the other camps on the island, and they too received schooling, as I understand it, but within the camp. I don't know too much about the specifics of that camp, but yes, certainly the boys and teenagers in Hutchinson and the other male camps received schooling in readiness for their exams when they left.
Now, you and I were chatting briefly about your research for this book. Joanna Lesser asks, how do you access records about internment? She says her father was a refugee from Germany in 1939, and she's working on a project about her family. He was interned in 1940 from Cambridge by Hoyton on the Isle of Man, and then sent to Quebec on the troop transport ship Ettrick. A day after the Andorra Star, he returned to Britain in 1941. She says she has information about it from his memoir and letters, postcard from the camp, knows the names of people he was interned with. What do you suggest? How can she find out more? Obviously there's a body of work published, but is there anything beyond that that she could access?
Yes, well, the government did make records for everyone who was interned. These were made at the moment of arrest, and that database is now public following a Freedom of Information request. You do have to have a subscription to access it, but if anyone who's watching this would like, you can email me, and I'm happy to search that record and send you the internee cards. I just need the person's name and year of birth, and I can do that. And on that card, it will list things like the date of the specific date of their release, or when the release was authorized, and then usually 7 days later when they walked out of the camp. And it will often have other details, such as when they would have left to go to Canada. in this chap's case, and when they would have returned, the precise dates of all of that. So that's one source of information. At the Manx Museum on the Isle of Man itself, they also have a separate set of records, and these were made when people arrived on the island and include a photograph. Unfortunately, all of the male records were destroyed, I think, in the 1980s at some point, but the women and children records do survive, and you can write to the curator at the Manx Museum, and they will be able to tell you more. But yes, certainly the most comprehensive set of records is the government's own, the Home Office set, which if you email me, I'm happy to search for you.
It's a very generous offer of you, Simon. And if people want to send emails care of the address on the Millen website, we'll gladly forward those on if people don't have your email address. Suzanne Korn asks, did people leave the UK after the war because of the treatment they'd had?
Well, I mean, certainly some of the very first people to leave the camps did so on the proviso that they would immediately emigrate. And so I think on the 5th of August was when the first batch of people left the Isle of Man, so quite fairly soon after the arrests. But they had said that, you know, they would agreed in writing that they were going to emigrate mostly to the US. I think they had about 30 minutes to make that decision whether they were going to do that with their wives meeting on the island. So quite a stressful situation, as you can imagine. In terms of the remainder of the internees, I think by the end of the war, perhaps the sort of feelings of hurt and injustice had cooled somewhat, and most individuals chose to remain in Britain and make their lives here, and would sought to assimilate as quickly as they could, so change their names from German variants to English variants, and you can certainly see this when you read when you contrast the diaries written at the time when people were inside the camp. They're often very, very depressed, very angry at the injustice of the situation, and then when you compare that to memoirs written, say, in the 1970s or 80s, a few decades later, often the view of internment and individuals' internment has softened somewhat, and they sort of look back on it more fondly. I suppose some of that's human nature, in that we sort of tend to downplay the more stressful parts of life and play up the better ones, but some of it as well, I think, was a way to square having chosen to make their lives in the country that had previously arrested them on suspicion of being Nazis, ludicrously in the vast majority of cases.
Now we have an interesting question from Janet and Terry Stowe. A few months ago, we had Leah Garrett speaking to us about the X Troop. This was the sort of crack squad of army officers made up of people previously interned. So were any of these people from the Isle of Man part of that, as far as you know?
Well, certainly one of the most efficient ways to leave internment, you may remember that showed the slide of the white paper, that was actually quite a high bar in the early weeks to leave, but the British government did opt to allow people to join the pioneers. So if you agreed to join the pioneer, which was at the time was a non-fighting unit in the British Army, then that was one of the quickest and easiest routes out of internment. You had to pass a fairly stringent physical exam, so most people over the age of 30 didn't meet that bar from checking the records, but many did, and then later on the pioneers were allowed to go into combat, and many of them went to served during D-Day and were in fighting units. Whether they were specifically in this, I'm sure there would have been, but I wouldn't be able to say with complete certainty.
Now, Dr. Colin Lecce, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly there, Dr. Lecce. Were there any religious services provided to the internees by the UK Jewish community, the Chief Rabbi's office perhaps, or the Board of Deputies?
Yes, there was. So 80% of the internees in the Isle of Man camps were Jewish, and of course that ranged from very devout individuals from the Orthodox tradition right through to people who really only consider themselves Jewish via one grandparent or something. So for those who were more devout, Dr. Rabbi Schonfeld Skonfeld, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his name, but who I'm sure will be known to people who, for his role, bringing aid to various people via Kindertransport and other initiatives. He visited the camps on numerous occasions and made sure that they were everything was supplied to that community that they would need to continue to be observant. And also Bertha Bracey, who I mentioned earlier, was the chairman of the Central Department for Interned Refugees. She was a Quaker, but she of course was also very sensitive to individuals' religious beliefs and needs, and was also really on it in terms of making sure that people were provided for. So yes, that is true. And in fact, in the book I go into a fair bit more detail about exactly what provisions were made for that community.
Now, Valerie Bloom asks, did the public know what the inmates were experiencing and indeed what they were achieving during the war or afterwards?
Well, Bertha Bracey was quite eager to actually take the art that was shown in the exhibition I showed you earlier and make it a touring exhibition around Britain to sort of reveal to the British public exactly the kind of work that was being produced in the camps and the kind of people, of course, that we had interned. There were many people going into the camp and writing reports, including the Quakers, but also members of the Jewish community, and writing up very detailed reports. Some of these were then reported in the press. The Manchester Guardian was quite good on this, publishing reports of, and I think there was mention of the technical school I mentioned earlier, that made it into the Manchester Guardian. So there was some awareness of what was going on. But I suppose really the sea change in public attitude was the sinking of the Arundel Star, which initially the British government said, oh, well, it was mostly dyed-in-the-wool Nazis who were on that ship that we were sending to Canada. So while it's sad that it was sunk, it's just part of warfare. But then the further inquiry showed that this was not the case, and there were in fact many so-called Category C refugees who were genuine refugees from Nazi oppression who were killed in the sinking of that ship. And yes, that sort of was really the instigator, I think it's fair to argue, for the change in policy.
Alan Mann is asking about people anglicising their names further to joining the Pioneer Corps,
yes.
Considering whether that would make it easier for them to be naturalised following the war.
Possibly. I mean, the very practical reason that people were told to do this was that if they were then sent to Europe and were captured by the Germans, it was a way to hide the fact that they had German and Austrian lineage, and in most cases were Jewish lineage as well. Whether it actually made it easier or not to be naturalized, I'm not entirely sure if that would have been a factor or not. But it's certainly true that most individuals, when they I don't know if most, but many individuals, when they naturalize, change their names to sort of, I suppose to assimilate, and in some cases probably to cover up the fact that they were refugees, because they had already experienced being ostracized as a result of that in Britain.
We have a question from Gabriel Sivan. He's actually in Jerusalem. He says, as a small boy, he became aware of some German Jewish girls who'd been adopted by families in his native Liverpool, and he believes their brothers were incarcerated in the Hoyton camp. Was there any difference between conditions there and those you've described in the Isle of Man?
Yeah, so Hoyton Camps is on the outskirts of Liverpool. It's a very large camp, and again, probably not too different. I think it was probably more pleasant to be on the Isle of Man, perhaps, because you could go, there were escorted walks in the hills. There was, they arrived in the summer and were allowed to go to the beaches as well and things like that, obviously under armed guard. And I'm not sure, if that was also the case for the internees at Hoyton Camp. But really the most the most terrible conditions were at Wharf Mill, which was a camp that most of the individuals who went on to Hoyton would have gone through, being in the north. And this was really sort of where, they not only had a terrible living conditions, but also terrible psychological conditions. One of the terrible things that Major Alfred Braybrook did was to occupy the men. He said, look, if you can find a scrap of paper, write down your story, how you came to Britain, and I'll pass it on to the government and it will help towards maybe getting you out. And so, of course, there was then this mad scramble for toilet paper or anything that anyone could write their story out on. And as soon as that paper got to Braybrook, he just threw it away. He never passed it on. The only sort of small recompense in that story is that he was court-martialed for his behaviour and went to prison for a period. So at least there was some justice in that case.
Yvonne Cheney, who is in Southern California, is asking about other camps. We've mentioned one just now, but were there many others for these so-called enemy aliens? And perhaps if I pair that with a question from Malcolm Addlestone, who says, do we know what the local civilian populations made of the presence of these camps in their midst?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, there were 10 camps on the Isle of Man, and that number moved around a bit depending on the needs, how many internees were coming to the island at any one time, and of course, as the internees began to be released throughout the autumn and the winter of 1940, the number of camps decreases and people have moved in. So people who were in Hutchinson may have been in Onken, may have been in some of the other camps on the island as well. In terms of the British mainland, there were a number of camps. There were transit camps as well as Wharf Mills that were around. As far as I understand, I spoke to Dr. Rachel Pistol, who's an expert at King's College London on this, and as far as I know, we don't know the exact number of internment camps there were during the period, because at some point there were just so many sort of opening up in sort of regions that were only open for a small amount of time as transit camps. And some of the Kempton Park Racecourse was also one. York Racecourse, I believe, was one as well. So yeah, there was a big variety in the kind of place that you could be held. But the long-term camps tended to be on the Isle of Man. In terms of the local population, I think the timing where the first individuals were arriving at the Isle of Man had some bearing. It was right after Dunkirk, and so there was certainly a sense of anti-German sentiment around that was aimed not only at fighting Germans but just German nationals as well. And there are reports of when the first boat arrives at the Isle of Man that there are locals standing there and sort of hurling insults and throwing clods of mud and things like that. And there was just really, I think some of that was a desperate a lack of understanding of who these individuals were. There was a famous story that went through the internees where they said, one of them, when they landed, overheard a British officer saying to one of his soldiers, "Oh, I had no idea so many Jews were Nazis," which I just think shows the confusion that was reigning at that time. I think after the first few months, in terms of the women's camp, there was some animosity there between the women's camp. Was the only place where locals were embedded in the boarding houses with the internees. That didn't happen in the men's camp, so you can imagine there were tensions there as a result of that, and also because there were some genuine Nazi women in that camp as well. So it was a real hotbed of tension. But those did ease in the later months, and there are also stories of local Manx people offering their houses to wives who were visiting from London to meet with their husbands who were interned, free of charge. And so there were, of course, as you would imagine anywhere, there were also very kind and generous people as well.
One last question is from Harriet Brostoff. What happened at Grisdale Hall, and where is it?
Grisdale Hall is in the Lake District, and yeah, like I say, it was a POW camp, either 1 or 2, I can't remember. It was for U-boat men who were sent there, and the very famous U-boat ace Otto Kretschmer, one of the trio of German U-boat aces, was captured, and he was brought to Grisdale Hall. It was a site of a couple of escape attempts. I think there was one where the men hid in a vegetable patch under the soil, but they got caught. And then at some point, I think it was there right until the end of the war. You'll forgive me, I'm not an expert on Grisdale Hall, but I did do some reading on it. And I think that some very senior German army officers ended up there, people who had been around long before Hitler showed up, and so there were sort of numerous interviews done to sort of understand the German military thinking. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story, but yeah, I was drawn to this one for this book instead.
Well, thank you so much for being our guest this evening, Simon. There's an amazing conversation that's been going on in the chat. People are connecting up, and people are going to help each other with their research, which you've obviously helped to inspire. We've had more than 100 people tuned in watching, so that's a really excellent evening.
For anyone who doesn't have a copy of the book, at the end of the book I do have a roll call of every name of every individual that I discovered was in Hutchinson camp. It's around 1,200 names, and it's got their date of birth, when they were released from the camp, their job when they arrived in Britain, and so on. So that might be of interest to some people as well.
I'm sure it will be. And if you want to buy the book, there's a link on our website, and also in the follow-up email we'll send you tomorrow. If you buy the book that way, it helps Milim a little bit, but it won't cost you any more. The book is also available from all good booksellers. And to say thank you to you, Simon, I'm going to send you a copy of this. This is some of my photographs of the Israeli ambulance service in action. So hopefully you'll enjoy reading that. It'll find its way to you in the next few days. Now, just a few words about our forthcoming programme before we leave you. Next week, we have the Mancunian Bernard Lester. He's giving us a humorous look at his 50 glorious years as a dentist. Then on the 25th of July, we welcome Milim's stalwart Richard Zimler. I think this is his third visit to Milim, and this is the launch of his latest novel, The Incandescent Threads, and that is a really excellent piece of writing. We have many more amazing speakers coming up, so please do visit our website at milim.org.uk, sign up for our newsletter, and that way you'll be sure not to miss anything. All of our events are free, but you can make a small donation if you wish, and that will help us with the costs of putting on these events. Details on our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Simon Parkin, once again. Thank you so much, Simon. And looking forward to seeing you all again at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.